Hello, my name is Diane Southard, and welcome to Problems with Centimorgans. Before we really jump into that, I just want to make sure that we're all clear about what a centimorgan is. A centimorgan is really where numbers equal relationships. So a total amount of shared DNA is measured in a thing called a centimorgan, and we use that to determine how we're related to other people. Usually, it works really well, right? You have 3,500 centimorgans, for example. That's how much DNA you might share with a parent, your mom or dad. 850 centimorgans. That's the average amount for a first cousin, and so on and so on. And we've learned over time that these numbers work. Most of the time, these numbers do reveal relationships to us. And that's true, except when they don't. So before we get too far into things here, I really want to make sure that you're solid foundation about understanding how to use a centimorgan. If you haven't really explored that too much, don't start here, okay? Watch some of the other videos that tell you a little bit more about what a centimorgan is and how to use it before I teach you how not to use it or we address some of the problems that we have. Okay, so as long as you're pretty solid on what a centimorgan can do, now let's move into the things that might be tripping you up. So, problems with centimorgans. So a centimorgan can be helpful, but there are some situations in your family history which occur relatively often that are going to cause us some trouble with the way we use a centimorgan. So those three situations are multiple relationships, endogamy, and genetic variation. So let's go through each of those in turn. First of all, we're going to talk about multiple relationships. So in this case, I had a client and she wanted to know if her sister was her full sister or her half sister. I think this is a fairly common question that many people might encounter in their family tree. But even if this isn't you, I just want you to think about how relationships work and how much DNA is shared and how everything kind of adds together and gets stacked up. Okay, so if two people are full siblings, they should share an expected amount of DNA around 2,500 centimorgans. So her sister gets DNA tested. They're sharing 2,514 centimorgans, and I say, thumbs up, you guys are full sisters. And then, of course, my client comes back to me and says, okay, that makes sense and everything, but what if my father is my sister's uncle? So this is a multiple relationship. They have two different relationships to each other, which could be affecting the DNA. So how can we figure out if this is the case? Does this even make sense, right? So what we do is we have to think about these two relationships a little bit differently or separately. And what's the great thing about centimorgans is they're additive. So what that means is if we take the total amount of DNA we expect half siblings to share, which is 1,783 centimorgans, and we take the total amount of DNA that first cousins should share, that would be 874, we can just add those two together. So they'd be half siblings through their mother and first cousins through their father, and therefore they should have about 2,667 shared centimorgans. How much do they have? Well, they share 2,514. So the problem here is that amount of DNA is the same amount as full siblings, or about the same amount. So you can't really tell just by looking at the total amount of shared DNA what your relationship is. In fact, you guys, that's so important. I'm going to say it again. You cannot tell your relationship to someone by just looking at the total amount of DNA you share. There always is another explanation. So you always have to do genealogy to really make sure you're honing in on a specific relationship. Okay, so that's our first situation, multiple relationships. The second situation is something we call endogamy. So endogamy is kind of a fancy word, but really all it means is that you're part of a community of people who have intermarried with each other for a lot of generations. So some endogamous communities you might be familiar with would be Jewish populations, also Acadia, but really any kind of small community where people just didn't leave for a long time, you're going to experience at least a little bit of endogamy. So let's see if we can explain it a little bit better. What exactly is endogamy? Well, I like to think of it like this piece of licorice. So if you were to offer a child a piece of licorice and you were to offer them one long big piece or lots of little small pieces, but it was the same total amount, which one would the child choose? The big one, right? Every single time. Children want the bigger piece. And I want you to think about DNA inheritance kind of in the same way. We want our DNA to be inherited in big pieces. The larger the piece, the more likely it is that it came from a single common ancestor. So here's how this might look in your family tree. If two people are related to each other in a family that they do not have endogamy, meaning the couple that we see that they're related to is the only couple they're related to in their whole tree. So when we see this, we see large pieces of DNA being passed down from the ancestor to those people who took a DNA test. This is when you do not have endogamy. On the other hand, endogamy is when two people share the same amount of total DNA, but instead of in big pieces, they share it in a bunch of really small pieces. That usually indicates that their common ancestors are further back and there's lots of them. This is what endogamy looks like. So if you're looking at your own DNA matches, what you want are matches that have big pieces of shared DNA, not lots of small pieces that equal the same amount. Okay, so that was endogamy and multiple relationships. So the last factor really affecting how effective centimorgans are in our research is just the simple idea of genetic variation. So think of it this way. If you have a fourth cousin, for example, your fourth cousin could share 74 centimorgans with you. Or they could share 18 centimorgans with you. And that's a pretty big difference, but it's the same relationship. And that's the thing about DNA. While we can try to predict relationships based on the amount of DNA you share, you can see there's a lot of variation in human populations. In fact, with fourth cousins, you'll only share DNA with them about half of the time. So half of the time, your real, honest to goodness fourth cousins, you won't share any DNA with them. So you need to be really careful about how you're interpreting your DNA relationships because just the number itself really doesn't tell you everything that you want to know. So this is something that you keep in the back of your mind as you're working through your DNA matches, as you're trying to figure out how you're related to people. And essentially what you're looking for is this situation. This is what I call your umbrella to protect you against making bad assumptions when you've either got multiple relationships, endogamy, or just genetic variation. When you're looking at that DNA match and you're asking yourself, how am I related to them? What you're really asking is, can I see our common ancestor? If your DNA match is relatively closely related to you, and when I say that, I mean if they are third cousins or fourth cousins, if they're sharing, say, more than 40 or 50 centimorgans with you, you should be able to find your common ancestor. If you've worked and worked and worked at it and you just can't, it's very possible that you have multiple relationships or you have endogamy or we're just talking genetic variation and you may not be able to identify your common ancestor because it's too far back or because you have more than one of them. So don't beat your head against the wall. If you're really working hard to figure out a relationship to a DNA match, it could be that the amount of DNA that you see isn't really reflecting your relationship. So give that a try and let me know, of course, if you have any questions or concerns. Again, my name is Diane Southard. Thank you for listening to this little section about some of the problems we might encounter with our DNA. If you're interested as well, you can watch more of my RootsTech videos. I have some here in the exhibit hall, also some in the main RootsTech section. You can also go ask all of your DNA questions at our virtual booth called Your DNA Guide. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, sorry about that. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can. We are all over the place, always sharing tips and techniques that you can use. We also have a newsletter that comes out every month. So if you'd like to stay connected, we would love to have you be part of our community.